Like we talked about, your protagonist has a goal. The characters that block your protagonist from achieving that goal are the opponents. Most stories tend to focus on one villain who the protagonist butts heads with when pursuing the goal. But good stories tend to have more than one character that the protagonist is in opposition with. I would aim for at least 3. These opponents could be loosely connected or possibly not connected at all. Each of them puts pressure on the protagonist while pursuing the goal, and the fact that there's multiple levels of opposition keeps the story fresh and keeps the obstacles interesting. As an example, let's say there's a detective who's pursuing a murderer in a mystery story. One of the opponents could obviously be the murderer who's trying to block the detective from finding out who he is. Another opponent could be internal within the police organization. This is another cop that's also trying to mess with the detective's investigation for whatever reason. A third opponent might be somebody that's in the detective's life, say a ex-girlfriend, whoever it might be, that's also holding back the detective in a different way. So you have one story, one main character with 3 different forces opposing that main character achieving the goal. And in gripping stories, one of those opponents tends to be a surprise. So you don't necessarily know they're going to be a problem at the beginning of the story, and then you find that out in a twist. So for instance, let's go back to the opponent that's internal to the police department. That might be somebody that seems like an ally of the detective, but then we find out they're actually working with the murderer in a twist, and the detective might get led into a trap, creating a lot of conflict and a lot of tension in a big surprise reveal. Though your main character should have multiple opponents, one of them should stand out. This is going to be the main villain. It's really important that this main villain is imposing. So this should not be an easy fight between your main character and main villain. The main villain should actually be more imposing than the protagonist. That's going to create an imbalance of force and make the conflict of the protagonist that much harder. So in something like a action story, if you have 2 soldiers going up against each other, the villain, at least at the beginning of the story, should seem like the stronger, more capable soldier. The same rules apply even in a less action-packed story. So for instance, let's say you have a story that takes place within an office. If the villain happens to be one of the workers at a company, they should be smarter or more ruthless or have some sort of edge on the protagonist that makes them very imposing and makes it a very difficult fight. Your hero and main villain are obviously going to be in opposition, but they should also have a few things in common. I like to look at this concept like a dark mirror. So when a hero looks into this dark mirror, he sees a reflection of himself, but that's shadowed. He sees parts of himself that he knows are there, but he doesn't necessarily like. So for instance, let's say we have a detective protagonist who comes from a rough area. A lot of his friends growing up and even family members got into crime. The detective went into law, but this whole idea of a criminal culture is part of the detective's upbringing and part of his fabric. When he's pursuing the villain in the story, he sees elements of himself within that villain. And this creates a lot of opportunity for conflict. And these elements of conflict should not just press on the hero in terms of the external want that they're going for, the goal, but also the internal need. So the villain should challenge the hero in both ways, both externally by trying to prevent them from reaching the goal, and internally by forcing the hero to confront the need through the story. In the protagonist lesson, we discuss the importance of empathy. The same concept holds for a villain. So the idea of a villain who's a bad person just for the sake of being bad isn't really that interesting. You're better off having a character that's gray. So they're doing bad things, but the audience could understand the humanity behind those bad things. And there's two tactics to achieve this. The first is giving a villain a trauma earlier in life that caused the malicious behavior that they're doing now. So for instance, if a villain was abused in some way as a child, it might cause them to act in a certain twisted way as an adult. Even if the audience doesn't agree with the villain's behavior, they at least could see where it's coming from. The second tactic involves giving the villain a good cause that they're fighting for, but the means of them going about that are twisted or unsavory. This lets the audience see where the villain's coming from and realize that there might be some good motivations, but still keeps the villain held in a negative light because the way they're going about achieving that goal is violent or terrible in some sort of a way. So the audience still wants them to lose, but understands where they're coming from